The assumption that national wealth and health would somehow flow from independence of itself had proven naive. Pierce's vision of rich agriculture, busy industry, educated workers and beautified cities had run headlong into the challenge of economic recession and international competition. The economy out of which they had hoped to build a new nation was a shambles when Britain had handed it over, and in the face of people's eager expectations of a better life with independence, the young government found itself strapped for money. The holy writ of economic life everywhere was to balance the budget. Aware that many were waiting for the Irish to trip and show they couldn't, after all, handle their own affairs, this young government was determined that it too would be stable and would balance its budget. The result was that far from delivering the promised land, what the people saw was their first government cutting the wages of county council workers, partly because big farmers wanted to be able to cut farm labour wages. They even took back a shilling from the old age pension, and that meant a 10% cut. In the face of the great expectation of a better life with independence, the Dublin Corporation Board of Assistants was abolished. It was spending too much on feeding and clothing the unemployed. And the Minister for Industry and Commerce of the time confidently told his critics that though people might die of starvation, it was not the duty of a government to provide employment. Some of the unemployed might have gone to Australia. There was an invitation from the Australian government to give assisted passage, but the Irish government said no. That might be seen as an admission of defeat. We wanted international economic respectability, and in seeking it, the country achieved not just stability, but stagnation. To many, it was a time of disillusionment, as it became clear that we had not had a revolution to face the question of the use of wealth and the development of the economy. The great question of the ownership of the source of Irish wealth, the land, had been resolved with peasant proprietorship after the land agitation of the 1880s and 1890s. Those who now owned the land and the shops and businesses it supplied didn't want upheaval. It was a case of business as usual. So some continued to travel first class. After all, they still owned the railways. The same people still owned the major industries and the banks. These were the banks with fine nationalistic titles like the Bank of Ireland, the Hibernian, the Munster and Leinster, even the National Bank set up by Daniel O'Connell himself. But now it too, with the others, refused to loan money to the new state to help it develop, until they were prevailed upon to do so by the British Treasury. These were the people who might have put their capital into modern industry, but instead they kept their money safe in London and repainted the name of the rail company in Irish. In the big house, once the centre of power and influence, there was apprehension, insecurity. In this new emerging society, was there room for those who didn't fit into a narrow Gaelic Catholic view of Irishness? That fear provoked the plaintive spectacle of a delegation from the Church of Ireland Synod approaching Michael Collins to respectfully inquire if they were to be permitted to live in Ireland, or if it was desired that they should leave the country. That had followed on 192 Anglo-Irish houses being burnt in just over 1 year up to March in 1923, often by Republicans who saw them as centres of support for the treaty. Whatever the logic, it left the Anglo-Irish feeling vulnerable and threatened. On the one hand, the new Senate was so drawn as to give the Anglo-Irish 17 seats, and proportional representation had been introduced on the insistence of the British to protect our minority. Yet they were soon to feel apart and excluded. So it was that in the Senate, speaking of an anti-divorce law, Yeats lamented the tragedy that within 3 years of independence they should be discussing a measure grossly oppressive to the religious minority. We against whom you have done this thing are no petty people. We are the people of Burke, of Grattan, of Swift, Emmet and Parnell. We have created most of the modern literature in this country, the best of its political intelligence. They were already a depleted people, their young men wiped out on Flanders Field and on the Somme. Now it was the remnants of a tradition which faced the loss of power, the challenge to their tradition and culture. Fearing the worst, many sold up and moved to what they saw as the mainland, where, sadly, they found no natural home either. Houses were becoming islands of a different tradition in what was now asserting itself as a Gaelic country. Before partition, they had been the quarter of the population with the wealth and influence. Now cut off from the north by the border, they made up only 4% of the Serstad's population. They must have looked with longing eyes to the other side of the border, where their natural confrères of heart and mind were still the ruling class in their corner of the island. Now there were two governments on the island, and they eyed each other across the new border with suspicion, each believing and hoping that the other wouldn't survive intact. The northern government proclaimed its arrival with the building of the vast Stormont Castle as the seat for its parliament, a physical statement of their intended permanent separation. And, they told Dublin, they even wanted their birth certificate records out of Dublin, even if they'd tear them out of the ledgers. Meanwhile, the southern government still presented itself as the custodian of the northern national interest, paying the wages of school teachers who would undertake to opt out of the northern educational system, teachers who refused to even allow northern government inspectors over the threshold of their schools within the north. Mind you, the southern government's relish for the role diminished as the bills came in, and in time they gave it up. It was a fluid time with the two governments vying with each other. Even the border itself was uncertain, with the Commission still debating where the border would in fact settle. The South fully expected to gain Fermanagh, Tyrone and parts of South Armagh and Derry City. In fact, the Commission suggested that only a few slivers of land should go to the south, but a large chunk of Donegal would be ceded to the north. In the face of that, it was thought prudent to forget the whole business, and the 6 counties remained as they had begun. But despite an antagonistic neighbour, despite skeptical businessmen and bankers at home, despite the barrier of international recession, this hopeful youngster of a country was eager to get on with the job of improving the lot of its people by developing its major resource, agriculture, and by nurturing modern new industries. The cry went out, one more sow, one more cow, and one more acre under the plough, as the country rolled up its sleeves and threw itself into the job with gusto. The government set up the Agricultural Credit Corporation to help reform and develop our major resource, farming, to produce quality exports which would get us back into the British market. In industry, those with money were reluctant to risk investing in an unproven fledgling economy, run by men with more idealism than hard business experience. So the state itself was forced to try its hand at building industry. They searched high and low abroad for Irish business talent to do that job, and they found a very few. But amongst that gallant few, Tom McLaughlin, brought back from his job at Siemens to set up the ESB, which would provide the power for all that new industry. And when they could, they distanced themselves from the old enemy, turning instead to the Germans for power technology. The power station at Ardnacrusha was a brave and giant undertaking by any standards, fueling a pride that we were on the move at last. When the turbines turned for the first time in 1927, the power surged through a spider's web of cables which had been manhandled into position around the country. These were McGilligan's maypoles, as they were scornfully called, after the Minister for Industry and Commerce, Paddy McGilligan, by an opposition which couldn't see how, in a backward little country with Ireland's limited industry, the electricity produced could ever be used. But used it was. And in a few years, homes were lit by electricity in cities and towns, and industries were powered by it. And it filled the airwaves with the sound of the new national radio station, 2RM. These brave adventures were now providing jobs, valuable pay slips in rural areas which had never before seen an industrial job, or for that matter, a pay packet. It must have seemed that now we were overcoming the obstacles. We were on our way to achieving the reward of our own talents and labours, to which independence had been the key. But now the year was 1929. And on a Black Friday, the Irish dream was to suffer a blow from afar as crashing storm clouds gathered over a narrow little street in New York where the sun never shines. Wall Street.